Good evening, gentlemen. Michael, Cam, here we are again. This time we are going to be discussing episode 40 and 41 of Awakening from the Meaning Crisis by John Vervaeke. And I'm excited to get into these two episodes. It seems like we are now at the bald face of the last part of the summit of a big mountain. So we're now catching up with really big concepts and the payoffs. We're not yet at the peak. I think that's still about 3, 4 episodes away, but it definitely feels like the ascent is starting. That's kind of the feeling I have. Any opening thoughts, Cam or Michael?
But
I feel
go ahead.
similarly. Um, I will say I do want to say right out of the gate that I looked at our last episode that we recorded together, and I would go back to the format where we read the summaries at the outset to keep us on point.
Yeah, sure. That sounds good.
Kick us off.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm going to read the recap of episode 40 at the beginning of the transcript for 41. So we're pursuing the cognitive science of wisdom because wisdom has always been associated with meaning from the axial revolution onward. So that's a deep reason. Wisdom, of course, is also important for the cultivation of enlightenment, the response to the perennial problems. It's also playing a central role in being able to interpret our scientific worldview in a way that allows us to respond to the historical forces. And so wisdom is very important. We took a look at McKee and Barber, and we saw their convergence argument that at the core of wisdom is the systematic seeing through of illusion and into what's real. And this is very much like as the child is to the adult is to the sage. And then the two other important aspects of it, that wisdom is much more with how you know than what you know, which means how you come to know it, and also how you interpret the knowledge. And that wisdom is, therefore, in a related fashion, deeply perspectival and participatory. And that's why wisdom can be associated with important forms of pragmatic self contradiction. We then noted the connection with overwhelming self deception in a systematic fashion and the emphasis on wisdom on the process rather than the products of knowing. And that both of those took us into the work of Stanovich. And because he famously argues that one of the, sorry,
Hallmarks.
I
Do
this page is jumping around on me. Bear with me here.
you want me to continue?
Yeah, I got it. And
Okay.
I'll go back to Stanovich,
Yeah.
that that both of those took us into the work of Stanovich. And because he famously argues that one of the hallmarks of rationality is valuing the process rather rather the process in addition to valuing the products of our cognition. And that took us also into the discussion of rationality, and Stanovich is a good bridge because for him, the notions of rationality and ameliorating foolishness overlap very strongly. And we got into this notion of, at which I've been sort of comprehensively arguing throughout this course, that rationality has to do with the reliable and systematic overcoming of self-deception and the potential affording of flourishing by some process of optimization of achieving our goals, with the caveat that as we try to optimize, we often change the goals that we are pursuing. One reason being that we come to more and more appreciate the value of the process as opposed to just the end result of the process. So I would stop there, I think,
Yeah, I think so.
and dialogue.
It's a
So
fantastic summary.
It certainly is. Amazing.
Any key part of that you want to key off of?
uh,
Well, go ahead.
no,
If
you
you
go,
had,
Michael. I've been talking a lot. So.
well, that there's one of the things that's very clear to me is how Vervaeke is making sure that we come to terms, meaning that he's actually being very clear about what his terms mean, which is, I think, a lot different than what these terms are often interpreted as in general. Right. And that he's very systematically working through that. And I really appreciate what he's doing a lot, because the exploration is incredibly relevant to things I've been trying to sort out my whole life.
Yeah.
Right. And even well, we're going to get into this later, but when he starts talking about what makes up wisdom and how it works. But and also the fact that he's tying all these things together, that wisdom is not separate from at least the aim of flourishing. Right? It's very dimensional in its effect and implications. It's not just that you're wise, you're not the wise guy in the mountaintop. I mean, wisdom can, should and can and should be used in everyday life down on the ground, which I think is
Yeah,
exactly.
it draws one deeper into participation with life.
That's right. Yeah, thank you. That's a really good way to put it.
What are the specific concepts of Stenovich West or otherwise in this episode 40 that kind of struck you?
That's a good question. Well, the other thing he's doing is he's starting to poke at rationality, which I think is incredible. Like, I mean, the way he approaches rationality to me is, especially in these two episodes, just fantastic. Like, I'm so excited about what he's saying about rationality. I mean, because I don't know, he talks about this, but rationality has often been people think it's related to just being very intelligent in very narrow ways, and that's not what he says it really is. Right? It's kind of the product of wisdom, I think, is or an aspect of a major aspect of wisdom.
So
yeah. What do you guys think?
Well, I was going to rattle off the section headings here from episode 40. And then Anurag, I was thinking of you as I was going through this because I think you're uh, more acutely focused on the sequencing of the argument, like the finer points perhaps than I am. I'm more interested in pulling out the practical application pieces, and
Please go
I
ahead.
don't necessarily understand why he's taking the steps that he's in. So if you have insight into that, I would love to hear it. But so here's the section headers out of episode 40. So insight, systematic seeing through illusion into reality, wisdom versus knowledge, perspectival and participatory aspects of wisdom, rehabilitating what it means to be rational, experiments on rationality debate, reason is the source of the norms, ought implies can, process of idealization. So, of those, probably the crux of it for me is the rehabilitation of what it means to be rational.
I agree.
So, could you play off of that?
Yeah.
Anurag?
Yeah. So, what I took away was there's this whole discussion of you need to be reliable when you're rational, not perfectly, but you also need to be systematic. It's a trade-off. Like, how reliable am I in my projections and my thinking? And the goal is to be able to, of course, overcome self-deception. What I found interesting was that he's setting up rationality different from expertise, and which I think is the first kind of step of the foundation. Because when we talk about rationality, we often conflate with, oh, that person is really an expert, so must be super rational, right? Super knowledgeable. That's the fallacy of an expert, right? So we equate expertise with domain specific knowledge and then say that's rationality. That must be really deeply thought through rationality. And he's questioning that right up front, especially in the era we live in where we worship experts of all sorts. He's basically saying rationality is domain general, not domain specific. So just because you have knowledge slash expertise in a particular domain does not make you any more rational in general other domains where you might not have that expertise. It's a very basic thing, but we keep forgetting it. And he is using that as a kind of a slab, as a step to say, let's cut out that connection because otherwise we'll keep thinking, oh, that person is so knowledgeable as an expert, they must be rational, right? So that I found was very interesting. And and then he says, like, we see that rationality in cog science is a study of errors and limits of, your knowledge. And we see people acquiesce on rational principle, but consistently fail to apply it themselves. That I found was very interesting. So, and then he talks about the belief persistence experiments, which basically means that we are so capable of fooling ourselves that even if we are given all the data that demolishes our belief, we are not still going to let go, right? So he's basically both talking about the psychology of committing to a belief, as well as if you happen to have a lot of knowledge and expertise in certain area, we somehow think now we are really rational, right? And he's just basically chipping away at both of those. Expertise in one area is not rationality in domain general purpose. And it's shown that your strongly held beliefs because of expertise might not actually be that rational because people pull away some of those facts and you still continue to believe in it. So I thought it's interesting because he's building towards this rationality debate. He's saying the debate is there has to be some way that we can be rational normatively. Like this is the norm. This ought to be the normative standard. And then there is a performative aspect. Can you perform in a way that you can get to that level of rationality? And he's trying to say those two must be different. And that's at least a theory of Cohen so far. He has not get to Stanovich. And he sets up this explanation of Cohen's view where he says there are two kinds of mistakes we can make, according to Cohen. Later on, it gets expanded. He said either we are very competent, meaning we have the capability to be rational, and we are performing to that, or we have the capability, but we can't execute on it. Our performance falls short. We have the capacity, but we can't perform. And he says that one is an error of implementation. It's just that practice more, get to know better, and suddenly you will be able to get there. Other is, we just inherently will not get there. We don't have the capacity, the hardware, software. And he's saying, it seems like, at least he's claiming, that all experimental evidence shows irrationality is performance errors, meaning theoretically you could get there, but when you start performing in actual activity or actual space or actual practical matter, you keep falling short. That's kind of how he's setting up the episode 40, Cohen's view of what he calls there's errors of competence and errors of performance. And according to Cohen, most of the time we just fall short because we don't seem to be able to get to that, even if we know what it means to be rational. That's kind of where he leaves the idea of rationality with Cohen's perspective. Then at the next level with Stanovich, he builds upon that argument and expands it theoretically. But for now, what he has done is decoupled expertise, knowledge, propositional belief in one area from rationality. And he's basically skewered this idea that, hey, listen, this guy is an expert in subject A, knows so much, has all the belief systems, has all the proofs and theorems and everything. But no, this person might not be rational. He's basically just split that, right? So far.
So there was this the episode that also had the bit about he made a point about probabilities?
That's the next one coming up.
Okay.
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
Okay.
He's going to use what I just described. He's going to use that to build upon the next two levels.
So is it fair to characterize episode 40 as basically saying this is what rationality is not?
Yes, all
Yeah.
evidence points to cognitive science, to the fact that our errors are systematic, and these are not actually performance oriented. This is the Stanovich West responding to Cohen. And at the end, this is where he leaves. That Cohen thought all our errors, our inability to be rational, the errors we keep making, is because our performance, poor performers. Stanovich starts with episode 41 by saying, hang on, that's not the case. Actually, most of the errors we have are systematic and not simply bad practice and bad performance,
Not lack of skill in a
not
certain
lack of skill.
realm, right? Yeah,
Yeah.
it's something else, right?
So you're right. So we can stop the episode 40 at this point, having, as I said, separated out something very important so that people are not confused, which 90% of people are confused when they say that person is very rational because they're an expert in PhD in science, so and so, right?
Yep.
And he even says here in under rehabilitation, rationality cannot be reduced to logic,
Exactly right.
which
Cannot be
is
used to logic, propositional.
or syllogistic reasoning,
Yes, exactly
right?
right.
So that's a big frickin' deal to say
Yeah,
that. Which I mean, these episodes are, I mean, these lectures are so incredible for me because it's finally uh, being able to organize in my mind why some people can be really smart and not wise at all, or I mean, smart and stupid at the same time is what I used to say, but I think now I would change it to intelligent and not wise. That would be
exactly.
my updated.
Intelligent and not rational,
And not rational.
which,
Thank you. Not intelligent, but not rational is what he says, and I
yeah,
just love that because I'm
wisdom
like,
is yet another step further away. Even basic, and we are building towards that correlation, the point three, right? Where very
yeah,
intelligent person, not rational.
not rational. Yeah, that's I've known that for years, but I didn't know how to explain why that was, or how to articulate it exactly. I kept seeing it in the world around me. So are we
Cam,
gonna? Yeah,
should we summarize 41 if we are done with
Sure.
40 the way you do
yeah,
it as to kick
yeah.
us off?
Let's do that.
Yep. So in episode 41, we were taking an in-depth look at the work of Stanovich and rationality because we were building towards an account of wisdom, because that is deeply intertwined with the cultivation of enlightenment and, of course, with the cultivation of meaning. We noted that rationality is an existential issue. It's not just a matter of how we're processing information. It's something that is constitutive of our identity in important ways and our mode of being in the world. And we'll come back to that again. One of the core things we saw as we took a look at the rationality debate in which Stanovich's work is situated is that debate showed us a couple of important things. It showed us, if I can put this as a formula, that rationality does not equal logicality and it does not equal intelligence. That debate also showed us that we need multiple competencies when we're talking about rationality. We need an inferential competency, but we need an independent competency of construal. I'm going to say that again. We need an inferential competency, but we need an independent competency of construal. And then I proposed to you how we could understand what that competency is and what the normative theory is acting upon it, namely insight, good problem formulation. We then moved into what Stanovich saw as the missing piece. If intelligence doesn't give us rationality, what's the missing piece? There's two missing pieces. They overlap in some important ways. One is the notion, he calls it mindware, what I've called psychotechnology. And the other is a cognitive style. And the cognitive style that he talked about was active open mindedness,
Mhm.
which he gets from Jonathan Barron. And this is the idea that what you should do is cultivate a sensitivity to the ongoing awareness of the presence and effect of cognitive biases in your cognitive behavior and your cognitive life, and to actively counteract them. I pointed out that, unlike Stanovich, who doesn't emphasize this as much, Jonathan Barron, who is the originator of this idea, as a constitutive of feature, as a constitutive feature of rationality, points out that you can't do that too much. Because if you try to override too many of your cognitive biases, you, of course, will also be overriding them in their functioning as heuristics
Exactly.
that help you avoid combinatorial explosion.
Mm-hmm.
So getting an optimal form of active open-mindedness rather than a maximum form of it is crucial to rationality.
What a beautiful summary.
So
Yeah,
that,
fantastic.
and that's the main note that I have written here, is exactly that point of I don't know how much he gave with respect to practicality of finding that optimum, but that's what's most interesting to me. So understanding that I am deliberately, because I guess I've experienced a fair amount of basically wrecking that heuristic limiting factor and finding myself overwhelmed by all of the possibility.
Yeah, can you
By
just
by
oh, sorry.
by
I mean,
open active mindedness is what are you trying to say? That by too much of open active mindedness is not what you say?
Too much counteracting, becoming aware of cognitive biases and deliberately counteracting them.
mm-hmm.
The subjective experience of that is that, oh, there's a lot of ways that I can go here. There's a lot of associations. Like my mind is open, and it becomes debilitating because
Yeah.
there's too many choices. Basically, is how
So
it
true.
feels.
Yeah, combinatory explosion. I've experienced that too, Cam, and it's interesting that I didn't really realize till this moment that that's what had happened. That I was, in a sense, too open and too willing to just like try to throw out everything that I had constructed in an attempt to go to the next level. But what I really was met with was incredible chaos and disassociation, almost like, I can't orient because there's not enough structure left.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it starts to take the meaning apart.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I've noticed that for me, I I start to take I start to see the associations in language itself. I start to see how what the contrivances of language itself, and it makes reality seem largely nonsensical.
Mm-hmm.
Gratefully, I've started to find myself, I think, at the layer below that where it starts to move into lyricism. So it starts to move into a musical domain, and then it feels like the order is coming back. If
Interesting.
that, I don't know if that makes any sense, but
It does metaphorically for me. I know what you mean. It's because you have to have a shakeup, but then it settles and reorganizes, but not too much because then, again, you get off the rails, right? Like, whoops, a little too much. But this an interesting what this is bringing up for me as an example is how certain movements, and I'll just pick on postmodernism because it's in my face these days. They had a lot of fairly salient points about society and other things, but their answer to it is to tear it all down and
Yeah.
just rip it all down.
Yeah.
It's like, yeah, you
Yeah.
can't do that because
Yeah.
then the whole structure of function is gone, and then everything just deteriorates into total chaos.
Yeah.
Rather than saying, okay, let's face this, in incremental steps and see what's a practical way to possibly alter something that isn't quite right. But not that I think that they would ever reach that because their whole system is too incoherent in my sense, too out of sync with reality is what I think. But anyway, so that's Fascinating. Very interesting.
So let me see if I can see the bridges I'm building from the set of arguments he had started. What I see him do in this episode, just to unpack the summary you had of this episode, is that he had already started by saying expertise and domain specific knowledge is not necessarily rationality. Rationality has to be domain independent. And then he says, Cohen said, maybe it is like, we know how to become rational, but our performance is poor. And then Stanovich and others come back and say, no, actually, all the errors we make through all the experiments we have done are systematic and repeatable. And they introduce this idea of known set of cognitive biases. So it's no longer that we are randomly performing poorly in any direction possible, probabilistically. He says there's a pattern to our biases, whether it's confirmation bias, whether it's my side bias, and all those other biases that have been detected and repeatedly proven in cog science experiments. They're saying there's a systematization of the biases. But then they go a step further and say, therefore, the answer is not that we are doomed, therefore, there's no rationality. He's saying, therefore, this idea of domain competence, there are many kind of competencies that you need,
Yeah.
right? So rather than say, we can't be experts in a single narrow, fair enough, that doesn't get you rationality. We have all these biases that are proven, the traps we fall for. But the answer is there are multiple kinds of competencies in multiple capability areas. And everybody has to manage that boundary of different competencies. And that's why you can have pragmatic self-contradiction. You might say, according to this capability, I believe this, or I experience this, or I participate and my skill is here. But this other competency tells me something slightly different and I need to reconcile it, or I just can't reconcile it. I'll deal with the pragmatic contradiction and keep moving. So he's basically decomposing that. And then he says, but here's a challenge, right? So you, at some point, if it is not intelligence alone and it requires all these different capabilities, how do you put it all together? How do you course correct systematically the errors? And they basically said, I love the explanation he had. We should bring it up. The two explanations of how to get to wrong answers.
Right. I
Right?
love that part.
Fallacy versus misunderstanding.
Yeah, fabulous.
I loved it. Well, fallacy simply says, I understood the problem. My problem is then I applied all my intelligence, rational logic, algorithms wrongly, and I came up with the wrong answer. Misunderstanding is I didn't even grasp the problem properly. All right. So, and then I applied the logic correctly. Right.
Right.
So basically, he says most of the rationality problem is actually not application of logic issues. That is why it's poorly correlated to intelligence. Most of it is not algorithmic or logic chain or deductive horsepower or computational. Most of it is misunderstanding the problem
Yeah.
because it's fuzzy and misunderstanding the nexus of problems.
Mhm.
And that requires a different capacity than intelligence alone. And that's where he talks about that capacity is what you are calling construal of the situation or understanding with a capital U. To understand a problem area fully, deeply appreciated, rather than worry about whether the logical chain that follows is correct or not. That's harder. And which starts pointing back to this idea of relevance realization and pre-inference. Like, so
Yeah.
how do you understand it before you actually have applied the logic to it? So there's
Yeah.
something happening.
What's the frame? What's the
Yeah.
story? What's
Mhm.
what's structuring your perceptions in the first place?
Yes. So that's where he comes back to the two ideas. One is active open-mindedness, which is the state of mind that allows you to keep your options open. And the other is insight generation or better understanding. Right? So that is why if you have open active mind for too long, you can't converge. Like it's everything is
Yeah.
now feasible. You fall into the conspiracy theories every day because every pattern that seems to spark seems like, oh, that's meaningful, that's meaningful, that's meaningful. But then you have to kind of, that's too much of active open-mindedness. And then other is, do you really understand the problem area, the domain of what is to be understood? Do you really understand it? And do you have insight into that that anchors you? That is pre-inferential.
So you think it's possible to make
Hmm.
that real at all in this dialogue? So what
That's,
that,
Dialogue example would be, I'll
yeah,
give
what's an example? That'd be
I'll
great.
give you an example of, look, I'll take a very relevant example that everybody is talking about stupidly. UFOs, right? Right. So if you have active open mind, you can go down and look at UFO studies for last 100 years, 50 years, from Second World War, 50s, area, whatever, 51 or whatever it's called. You can go down the UFO history, it's the intelligence, it's green, it's like alien civilization, whatever. But the point is, these are all active, what he would call, using Vervaeke's language, these are plausibility things, plausible but no proof. And then you can fire up all these scenarios because you have an active open mind to all sorts of evidence from all sorts of sources, right? But at some point, you have to say, how do I converge into something that I can commit to as a daily action or daily path? If it is something I have to act on, live by, believe in, whatever your level of engagement is, besides just an intellectual curiosity, you have to then commit to it, right? Am I going to build a bunker in the basement because aliens are coming? Am I going to, argue and write a book? Am I going to wear a tinfoil hat? Like these are real decisions you might make based upon where you are in your landscape of active open-mindedness and what commitment you are making to the outcome of those scenarios. Then the insight might be, you might then have some understanding of the problem, not the theories, not the possibilities, not the probabilistic landscape, not the active mind. Your understanding might arrive you at a conclusion that, I'm making this up, this is my understanding, might be somebody else's, but it allows me to say, I don't know much about it. I know certain things that cannot be because of my other belief slash practice in science, but there is enough unknown that I can see that we have to withhold judgment on what the government could be doing or what the scientific experiments might be run, what some unknown governments or other institutions might be doing, or some other thing. So I'm open to some possibilities from active open-mindedness, but I'm not open to all equally. And I am going to act only on the handful of possibilities that I am going to commit to of all because of some insight I am holding on as my understanding, which is apart from all the possibilities. And that insight allows me to converge and say, I'm not going to wear a tinfoil hat because I don't think that's what's happening. And
come on.
that's not how it's
Wait a
gonna
minute.
that's not how it's gonna get inside my head. So or not build a bunker for now.
But when they come to pick up the chosen, you won't be taken along with them.
So that's your different understanding frame. That you just leap to a different understanding inside, and you're
I think
applying that to a portion of the possibility.
that
Anyway,
it was a pretty good description. I like to add my own version of that,
yeah,
is
Please.
that in my practice, in my business, I'd study a lot of different things. I go to workshops, I have colleagues that I study with. And it took me a long time to figure out that I didn't have to study and memorize everything that was in front of me.
Yeah.
Right. And there's a number of reasons for that. And one is because, well, and this is so funny because way before I ever heard of Vervaeke, I came up with the term relevance. I'm like, I only need to focus on the relevant material that's applicable in my specific situation and
Yeah.
even given my capacities, right? So it was that whole sort of frame that, well, what resonates with me in a way that I can actually use in the practice. And that's based on many things, including my capacities. And then I would try them and then see the result with my clients and that was my test of relevance. And if they started coming back being better, then I was like, do more of that. Approach it more that way, and then build upon that. So that is a lot different than kind of the standard sort of thing that says you have to memorize everything. You have to recall every fact that you learned, otherwise you don't know it. And I really discovered that that's not true, actually. That's my understanding now of what geniuses do is geniuses are able to suss out the relevance and ignore everything else. And that's really fascinating because that's totally contrary to what the model of education is in this country.
Oh, yeah.
It's like, they're not telling you to do that. They're saying you have to get it right on the test, and that means you're smart,
Yeah.
except it doesn't. And that's, I mean, it means you have a certain capacity, which isn't nothing.
Intelligence versus rationality.
Exactly. So rationality is relevance sorting, right? And that's, and what I discovered to my shock was that many of my colleagues who were way better at memorizing anatomy and many other things weren't as effective as I was at the relevance part. And that was when I started to shift my attitude about how, I guess I didn't think of intelligent as what I used to call it, but I should now say how rational I am compared to them. In terms of rational, relevance realization being mixed into that as a component. So it's very, really cool stuff, this. In other words, I think that rationality is almost more about what to ignore than anything else.
Yeah, I liked how you said that.
Yeah.
That genius is, how did you say that? Genius is
Knowing how to sort what to pay attention to and what not to.
yeah. You're not paying attention to almost everything.
That's right. You have this ability to, I mean, I could use
So
Musk
does
as
that correspond with, I can't remember if it's this episode or maybe the next one, but he talks about, did you guys pick up on the bit about problem? It is the next episode. So it's episode 42. Did you guys get into that yet?
I have, but I don't, not only one round so far.
He talks about problem nexus.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, in the next episode. But even in this episode, he actually starts setting it up when he says, what does understanding mean? And he says you can decompose understanding into various kinds of combinations of if two people communicate, did they exactly understand what was sent
Right.
out and accepted? Was it received poorly? Then he breaks it down. But it comes down to formulation of the problem.
Right.
Right? That to me is such a powerful idea. Formulation of the problem. Right? Which is hard of understanding, and it is pre-inference. It is before you can apply logic to it. Right?
And if you don't do that right, nothing else works, right?
And that is tied to relevance, and that is a very personal thing. Like, why is that formulation of a problem relevant to you today, right now? And I actually think every time anybody changes a significant opinion on a major subject, life-changing opinion, such as nutrition, such as vaccines, such as health-related issues, among many others, right? Forget political beliefs, because people can carry political beliefs as hobbies or as social constructs. But when something matters to you, like, am I going to go on statins, or am I going to take metformin to avoid diabetes? Now, that is personal. That is like real. I need to now formulate the problem very clearly. And then I need to have an active, open mind about understanding whether, or like investigating all possible answers, not just statins are great or metformin is the right answer, right? So then I will go through the active, open-minded process, and I might come up with 75 theories around cholesterol or whatever. But at some point, I need to own the problem formulation, and I need to see how far I go and solve that for myself. So it's actually a fairly profound back and forth of how far I go into rationality. And it's not logic, because I could logically defend 5 different theories of statin, prostatin, antistatin, whatever, right? Every one will have journals and journals and journals of defense. But then I need to have my understanding of that, and then my problem relevance of that, and my ability to apply that.
Yes,
And I've
that's
practiced that and changed substantial points of view that I held before
mhm.
after going through this, because I had to face a problem I didn't know how to solve for. And I had to actively go back and say, I got to open my mind to this. And my priors are not working anymore.
So yeah, something wrong with the priors.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Uh,
that's there's another piece that has come up for me as well about relevance realization is that the part of it in my mind is if you have the right kind of mindset, what you're looking for is what we call in the therapeutic practices that I practice the primary, right? So the primary is that which started the problem. And what one of the models that one of my mentors showed me that just, God, it really changed my whole practice. He said, so I'm going to talk about body stuff now because that's the context, but he says there's all these different sensors in our tissue all through the body. Some are for pressure, heat, um, the speed in which a muscle moves. Those are spindle cells, they're called, and so on. And what happens is these sensors talk to each other, and then they send the data to your brain it's kind of like Intel. And then the brain centers, like the movement center, it's called the motor control center, decides how to move your body in relationship to the data it's receiving. And what he explained is that when one sensor goes bad, then it screws up its primary partner, and then that partner screws up its partners, and so on, and then it creates this sort of almost like a root-like structure of dysfunction.
hmm.
And what you can do is you can snip away at the little roots, or if you're lucky, you'll find the primary, the first beginning of the problem, and you'll correct it, and all those roots collapse. And then what you
Oh,
have is
interesting.
this huge improvement in someone's
Yeah.
condition, which I think is a good metaphor for everything that we face in life. Like all and there's the formulation of the question is, or the problem is, what is the primary thing that I need to focus most of my energy on to have the maximum effect on the thing I'm trying to solve? And you can't do that unless you have relevance realization, which is, I think, a higher order sorting orientation that demands a constant shift of perspective to be able to see what I just told you, right? That's it's a way, because I even do that in my practices. There is a method of testing out potentials. Now you use logic at first. You say, okay, here's the most logical thing I can start with. But you don't stay there and say, this is the solution. What you do is you say, maybe it is, and then you test it out and see how, if it works, and if it doesn't, you keep looking until hopefully you find the primary, and then you see a massive shift in the whole pattern of dysfunction. So does that make sense to you guys?
Yeah, yeah, it makes a lot of sense. Yeah, I appreciate that.
So that's
Um,
that's part of what just kind of wrote when you were talking about this, Anurag. I was like, God, this is so relevant to many of the processes that I've come to through experience, and it's just so fascinating because it is really, I would say, sort of the underlying structure of what it means to be effective in life and to move effectively towards better, right? That's the other thing, is it's the movement towards better means you have to look for the most relevant thing and ignore the other things, or at least put them to the side temporarily, and because you'll have a hierarchy of potentials, right? And then depending on what you test out, you rearrange those potentials until you either come to the end of your list and have to do another sort of disruptive sort of orientation, and then come up with new ideas, or you actually hit pay dirt and you've got a result that moves you forward to the next level.
can you speak a little bit more when you say potentials?
Yeah, again, I'll talk about it in my practice. It's easier for me to come up with that quickly.
Sure.
So let's say someone has frozen shoulder. I deal with that all the time. So there are certain clinical likelihoods of why that's happening,
Okay.
right? So a combination of that knowledge and what I do, what's called palpation, which is I feel the tissue so I can know what behavior it's in. And I also can do what's called functional muscle testing, which is to test specific muscles to see if they're firing properly or not. And then what you do is you can formulate an initial, maybe even short list of where to start. And then you treat and test to see if your assumptions have any validity. And then depending on the result of that, you would either, you probably go through your list, and maybe if it comes up short, then you step back again and go, okay, what else did I observe? What else is a potential I've known from the past? So I can create a new list and start over until again, and that knowledge builds. So, you have this, it's actually deductive reasoning, a lot of it, but you have to keep your mind open, because part of what my mentors taught me is that most people approach the body, practitioners, doctors, with a solution in mind rather than seeing what's real within that body in front of you in reality. So it's actually participatory what I do.
Yeah.
Right. And so you want all of that, right? It's not like that knowing the knowledge ahead of time is wrong. It's just that these people tend to stick with it, and they either don't have the skill or they're stuck in that mindset. So they're not actually looking for feedback. They're just looking to prove themselves right, which is a really big difference in approach. I mean, it's like, I have this idea and I'm smart, so I'm going to prove it right on this person. And of course, you know how that feels when someone does that to you. It sucks. It's like, Jesus, I don't exist. I'm just kind of a empty shell that you're going to play upon to prove your fantasy right about, what you've inferred from your separate kind of left brain dominant fantasy about how great you are. It's like, yeah, it's pretty, does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. I want to take a little bit of a turn, if you guys will allow me. We've got
Yeah.
about 8 minutes remaining, and I kind of want to maybe try to set up the conversation for episode 42 a little bit. We're already
Yeah,
into
sure.
it, I think. So in 42, he talked about the idea of problem finders, or the phenomena of problem finding. And that's where that problem nexus piece comes in. And what I'm wondering about is being wise with the imaginative capacity, and doing that in relation with planning for the future specifically. So the problem formulation is something like, I can imagine vast spans of time. Like, I can imagine practically an eternal future, and I act in the present. How do I formulate what I do now in the face of that real capacity to imagine at length like that? I don't know if that is that just
How do you frame that again? Frame that
Okay.
Yeah, I'm
again.
not sure.
Problem.
So I can imagine going to bed tonight. I can imagine waking up tomorrow morning. I can imagine going to bed tomorrow night.
Okay.
I can imagine a year from now. I can
Okay.
imagine beyond my lifetime.
Okay.
So that's a present reality, that imaginative capacity.
Mm-hmm.
So in the context of proper problem formulation, the that in and of itself seems like a problem, because what am I actually capable of doing now in that that
What do you mean in relationship to what you're imagining?
Yeah, or the direction of that imagination.
So I'm going to channel Peterson's view would be, Jordan Peterson's view would be that this is going to depend on your hierarchy of values.
Yes.
Right? Like we have infinite capacity to imagine all possible futures, but you have to convert all of that into some action, and that prompt and action, and where you direct your attention, and therefore then subsequently your energy and action will come down to what is relevant to you and what's the hierarchy of values you are solving for. Is it comfort? Is it like, or immediate problem that you are in pain, you need to solve for that? Or is it hunger? Is it some other goal that you're aspiring for that requires further planning? So I think it'll come back to hierarchy of values and where do you direct your attention and your energy to solve what altitude of problem.
Yeah, and I want to add something to that, which is, are you shooting to obtain something, or is your goal a process of moving upward? That is, so the process, I mean, he talks about that in these episodes, right? Where when you're trying to obtain it, and this is what Peterson says too, the problem with that is once you obtain it, you are lost because you have nothing to shoot for. But if
Right.
your goal is to have a process of forever reaching up towards an ideal, which can never be reached, that's actually where a sense of meaning, a sense of purpose, and even the sense of happiness or positive emotion comes from, is the perception of moving towards a higher goal regularly. Like, so, there's a steady march towards it. And so what Anurag said, I think, is exactly right, is that it really depends on what your value system is. Because if your value system is, I want to get laid as much as possible, I don't really care how I do it. So there's no like moral structure that says I should be honest or I just want to get laid or want money or something. You may get that, but that, so you're imagining a future of the next hot babe that you're going to nail. And then what happens is that because your value system is based on very base goals, it's very likely that you're not going to be very happy, fulfilled, and you may not be very well liked in the world, and you may eventually crash and burn because nothing you do is sustainable.
Is
Does that
that
make
the
sense?
problem? Is that the problem you were asking, or are we answering? Is that the question you were asking, or are we answering a
Or
question
do
you
we
were
go
not
off on a
asking?
tangent?
So somewhat. I opened it wide open, so what you're making me think about though is again, I do think that this is in 42 where he asks the question, Vervaeke asks the question, what can you do to trigger
Hmm.
that process of the development? He ends up concluding, I think, in that episode as to how malleable rationality is.
Yeah.
Intelligence, the base intelligence is not, it's relatively fixed, but but rationality itself is quite malleable. And he starts to get into the triggering of the development of the
Yeah.
capacity to
Yeah.
be rational.
That's
And
right.
that seems like to me, that seems like the goal. That seems like the direction. That seems like
Yeah.
how to channel the imaginative capacity is to be a presence and conduct a life in a way that is actually like relentlessly triggering of that in the people and creation around it.
Yeah.
Not quite. I don't see quite that leap. I see rationality being explained the way you are describing it, Cam, but that still leaves open the question of what you pointed to. And the goal, because we are, free agents.
You don't think I can point it to the development of it itself, like the eternal return?
All I'm saying is eternal return doesn't happen in vacuum. You have to have some goal direction that you
Oh,
are
I see.
solving for.
Yeah.
Even Buddha, after enlightenment, said, my
I'm gonna
goal
go.
is to enlighten others. And so there was always a valence, there is always a goal, there's always your agency is being directed towards some purpose. That's all I'm saying. And that purpose cannot be simply given to you by your rational faculty. That purpose can be served by it so that you are not fooled in your achievement of that purpose. But the purpose itself has to come from other source than the functionality of rationality, functional capacity of rationality. That's a very important and deep question. I would love for us to like wrestle with that because
This is
I
a
think
really good question.
because once we start getting into actually you have set this up perfectly, Cam, because as we start getting up to not just rationality but even rationality to wisdom, and he has a couple of layers he builds towards that, then all three of the layers, intelligence, rationality, wisdom, have some sort of interaction and loop. And I think becomes harder and more tricky to navigate that.
And it's why we're here. I mean, right? This is what we're trying to find, is that
Or
those
wrestle
answers.
with, grapple.
We who wrestle with Vervaeke.
We who wrestle with some lectures of Viveki, not even Viveki.
Exactly.
That's how it goes. It's humbling.
Very.
Okay, let me close out on that. Any closing thoughts before I stop the recording?
It's always a joy to practice with you guys.
Oh, absolutely. I'm just tickled by. Oh, one thing is that I met someone recently that I'd like to bring in to our group once we go to our next stage.
Nice.
I think he'll be an incredible addition, and he's very interested. So I
Awesome.
was excited about that. So
thank you.
and yeah, that'll be good. But yeah, this is just so enriching. I just can't think of something I'd rather be doing than pursuing this knowledge. This is
Thank you very much. With gratitude. Let's stop on that.